Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to more Babylonian Talmud reading. So today we're going to be jumping back in to Babylonian Talmud Berakhot, and we're not going to actually go ahead and review everything from the Mishnah and the commentary up through the end of this first paragraph of Gemara commentary. If you want to review on that, go back and look at the last video. But we're actually going to start with this paragraph right here with the master said. We got a little bit into this last time, but we had to stop right as it was getting kind of juicy and exciting. So we're going to go ahead and restart there and just review everything. So let's do what any good Talmud student always should do. And let's just read a little bit and then I will kind of explicate as we go. First off, we have the master said. Now, we have to first of all understand who is the master. The master in this case is referring to a Tannaitic sage that the stam is commenting on. Just to make sure those terms are familiar, the Tannaitic period is from 70 CE until 200 CE. It's the period in which the Mishnah is collated. And so the master, this is referring to someone from that period, someone from the earliest rabbinic period, a sage from the Tannaitic period, i.e. a Tana. Now, what the master said is a citation introducing something that this Tana has said. And so really we know that the stam, the anonymous voice in the Babylonian Talmud from 400 to 600 CE, somewhere in that time range from the Stamitic period, is basically saying, I want to use this Tannaitic voice in this passage here. So the master said is something that the author of or someone from the Tannaitic period, that's what they would have said. So we have the master said, from the time that the priests entered to eat their terumah. Now you might recognize the capitalization over here again. That goes back again to our Mishnah. So this is a citation from the Mishnah. From the time that the priests enter to eat their terumah. Now we have a few questions that are going to arise from this mishnaic citation. The first question is, when do the priests eat terumah? So that's question number one. Okay, if we are going to be reciting the evening Shema when the priests eat their terumah, again, going back to the mishnaic question, from what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? From the time that the priests enter to eat their terumah, well, if the priests are eating their terumah, and that's when we know we can begin to recite the evening Shema, when is that happening? And we have our first answer to that question, which is from the time of the appearance of the stars. So this first question is really a question about additional information. Let's just provide something that is kind of helpful to know, obviously for this Mishnah, and it's kind of just a little bit of a fun side comment. Now, where it gets a lot more exciting, I think, is with the second question. It doesn't quite look like a question, but there's a question mark at the end, uh, right here. So I think you'll see in a second. Uh, the Tana, again, this is the person composing the Babylonian Talmud, says this. Let him, i.e., the Mishnaic sage, i.e., the master, i.e., the Tana, let him then say, from the time of the appearance of the stars. In other words, he's commenting on the Mishnaic language. Why didn't the Mishnah use this alternative formulation for when the priests entered to eat their for when the evening Shema can begin to be recited? The Mishnaic author has tried to say that the priests enter to eat their terumah is the time when the evening Shema can be recited. But what if it's actually just when the stars appear? That would make it a whole lot simpler. The temple isn't an institution at the time of the composition of the Mishnah, or when, when the Babylonian Talmud is being composed. So why didn't the Mishnaic author do something a little bit more simple and just say, when you see the appearance of the stars in the sky, which is something that we see every single night and can all witness, when you see that, that's when you can begin to recite evening Shema. The reason that the Mishnaic author does not do this, the reason that he does not say from the time of the appearance of the stars is for two reasons. First of all, he wants to teach us, this is what the stam says, in passing that the priest may eat truma from the time of the appearance of the stars. So it's a little bit of kind of a random aside. Hey, guess what? You ever want to know this? Fun fact. When the priests enter to eat their truma, that's when the stars appear. So that's a little bit of kind of like a random aside. Now you get to know the eating time of truma. But there's also something else that we learn from this. And I want to pause here before I get to the second answer, because the second answer we actually have not discussed in the previous video. And that is something called the concept of scripturalization of Mishnah. I'm going to back up a little bit and introduce a new concept called midrash. And midrash is Jewish rabbinic commentary on the Bible. Midrash views every single word, every single verse, every single everything in the Hebrew Bible as chock full of significance that they can kind of exploit and draw interpretations from. And what's interesting is that the authors of the Gemara do the same thing to the Mishnah. They see that, or they believe that every single aspect of Mishnah, every single word has been carefully chosen for a purpose. So there's no way that this mishnaic author didn't think through the fact that he was talking about the priests eating truma as the time of the appearance of the stars. He knew that, but he specifically chose for two reasons, the second of which we're about to get into. He specifically chose for two reasons to say that the evening Shema can be recited when the priests enter to eat their truma. There's an Aramaic term for this called tzrichuta. Derives from the Hebrew word sarich or sricha in the feminine. When you hear that a sound, that's just an aleph at the end of the word tzrichuta, which in Aramaic is the definite article, like the hay, like hay har, the mountain, like hay is at the front of words in Hebrew. So a tzrichuta is something that is just so uh, important. It's needed, right? Sarich, to need. The Mishnah uses this formulation discussing the priest eating truma as the time of the evening Shema, not the appearance of the stars, because otherwise we as the readers would miss really important information. Nothing in the Mishnah is there randomly. That's because the Mishnah has this scriptural character where everything, every word is chock full of significance and can be commented on. Everything is sarich. Everything is needed. And everything in the Mishnah is always there to teach us specific legal ramifications. So I just want to kind of let that rest there for a minute. That's why the author of the Mishnah chooses to do something a little bit odd. In our minds, we might say, okay, if I'm going to try and offer a commentary to someone, I'm going to make it as simple as possible. I'm certainly not going to talk about an institution that no longer exists and talk about priests and talk about truma and, temple and all of that. If I want to tell someone when they can recite the evening Shema, I'm going to kind of go with something timeless and tell them, okay, when you see the stars in the sky, go ahead and recite the Mishnah. But that's not what the Mishnaic author chooses to do, and that's significant in and of itself. So the first question, when do the priests eat truma from the time of the appearance of the stars? That's kind of just commenting. Like that's kind of like a Bible commentary. You open up a Bible commentary and you look, in your verses, maybe you're in Numbers 22:1, and you look at what the Bible commentary has to say, and then you get a little bit of an answer. That's kind of what's happening with this first question. When do the priests eat truma? Okay, the commentary from the time of the appearance of the stars. But this second question is super significant. Why didn't the Mishnaic author say from the time of the appearance of the stars? Well, the stam is going to kind of come up with that reason, and that's where he comes up with he wants to teach us in passing, because the stam cannot come into a concept of Mishnah where every single word is significant. Every single word is tzrichuta, needed. In a more positive, let me reframe that positively. The stam believes that every single word in the Mishnah, every single phrase, every single sentence, everything in the Mishnah is chock full of significance and has not been placed there randomly. And so the Stamitic author here in the Babylonian Talmud is saying, hey, the Mishnaic author really just wanted to teach us, first of all, that the priests eat truma when the stars appear. So now we have that kind of random piece of information. So again, going back to this let him then say, like I said in the last video, let him then say is a common way that the stam, that the Talmud introduces possible alternative formulations that the Mishnah could have chosen. And then it says, but the Mishnah didn't choose that because he made a very deliberate choice in his wording, tzrichuta. It was necessary, it was needed, it was important. But again, that question, let him then say, is ultimately asking why that particular wording. To use the fancy term, it's saying, why is that lemma, i.e., this proof text here from the Mishnah, why is that needed? And so we get the first answer. Well, first, random fun fact, you know the time of the eating of the terumah. But the second answer, and this is where this Gemara gets challenging to say the least. So let's go ahead and read a little bit for kind of the answer, a second answer to the second question. So starting right here, and he also wants to teach us, i.e., the Tana wants to teach us that the expiatory offering is not indispensable. That is, the Tana wants to teach us that the expiatory offering is dispensable for the priest to eat terumah. For the priest to go ahead and eat terumah, they don't need to have done the expiatory offering. And how in the world do we derive that from the Mishnah, from the time that the priests entered to eat their terumah? I mean, doesn't that seem like a really, really random leap? Where in the world does the Mishnah talk about the expiatory offering being dispensable in order to eat terumah? It doesn't. And that's the point. The fact the Mishnah does not mention the the expiatory offering is, yes, absence of evidence that the stamiatic author then turns into evidence for absence. I hope I put that right. But I think you understand what I mean from kind of that fun idiom that we like to use. But basically, because the priests can eat their terumah according to the Mishnah with no mention of this expiatory offering, we learn that the priests do not need to do an expiatory offering in order to eat the terumah. I understand that is strange. They're saying that the expiatory offering is dispensable because it's not mentioned in the lemma, it's not mentioned in the Mishnah as a precondition for terumah eating. Supposedly, if it would have been important enough for the priest to have done before the expiatory offering, the Mishnah, the lemma, would have mentioned it as a precondition, but it doesn't. Okay, that is a little bit weak. Basically, from this formulation here, from the time the priests entered to eat their terumah, from that mishnaic formulation, we're supposed to learn that the expiatory offering is dispensable, can not be done in order to eat terumah. I don't like that reasoning. I'm guessing that you don't like it either. And the rabbis seem to recognize that it wasn't as strong as it should be, because what they do next is bring in some supporting evidence, as all good arguments should have. So we're now going to look at this portion, and it has been as it has been taught, So first of all, I need to kind of orient you to what as it has been taught is setting us up to know. As it has been taught is a formulation that introduces a Tannaitic teaching. So a Tannaitic teaching, again, Tannaitic period is the period from which the Mishnah comes. So a Tannaitic teaching is coming from that period. But it's not from the Mishnah itself. What it actually is from is it's from something we call a Beraita, Tannaitic, non-Mishnaic teachings. That is, teachings from 70 to 200 CE that are not actually part of the Mishnah. And in particular, I'll let the cat out of the bag and say that this Tannaitic teaching is from a text that we call the Sifra. And the Sifra is a rabbinic commentary on the book of Leviticus. And so they're basically going to bring in this midrash. I mentioned midrash earlier. It's a midrash, a kind of a rabbinic commentary on the book of Leviticus to try to support the understanding that the priests do not need to perform an expiatory offering in order to eat their terumah. And so let's go ahead and read here. As it has been taught by, the Sifra, by this Tannaitic teaching, by this Beraita. And when the sun sets, vetaher. So the first thing to note is that we're within the frame of the Sifra now, of this Beraita, of this Midrash, but we see italics. And as we've learned from earlier, italics indicate that we are working with a biblical source. So this is where you have to understand that the Midrash actually cites biblical sources. It will cite, a line or some portion of the biblical text, and then it will comment on it. So this is just a mishnaic form. We're within the midrashic form, excuse me. We're within the confines of the midrash right now, but we're just getting that scriptural citation that's part of midrash. So, and when the sun sets, ve'taher. And now that we've had that citation, we're going to hear the Tannaitic teaching in this midrash commenting on those few words. And when the sun sets, ve'taher. And ve'taher is just a Hebrew word that is left untranslated on purpose. We'll see that later when we get into an argument between a few stamaim. So, what we now learn is that the setting of the sun is indispensable as a condition of his fitness to eat terumah, but the expiatory offering is not indispensable to enable him to eat terumah. Okay, let's particularly pay attention to that second section of this midrash, of this baraita, of the sifra. The expiatory offering is, double negative, is dispensable to enable him to eat terumah. So this seems really, really nice. At first, we just had the stam trying to say that because the expiatory offering is not mentioned up here in the Mishnah, then it must be that the expiatory offering is not needed in order for the priest to eat his terumah. But even better, we now realize that that we basically have a baraita justification of a stamitic interpretation of the Mishnah. It's crucial to note that the Mishnah itself is not saying that the expiatory offering is dispensable. Rather, that is a stamitic interpretation of the Mishnah, working basically with absence of evidence in that mishnaic lemma, in the mishnaic citation. The baraita is justifying how the stam understands that Mishnah. The baraita is justifying the stamitic interpretation of the Mishnah to say, look, the baraita agrees with me. I'm Mr. Stam. The baraita agrees that no expiatory offering is needed to eat terumah. So the stam is bringing in the baraita to support his own conclusion about the Mishnah. The baraita affirms the validity of his conclusion from the Mishnah. In other words, it is valid to learn that the priests don't need the expiatory offering before terumah. First of all, according to the stam. First of all, we learn that from the Mishnah. First of all, we learn that the Mishnah doesn't talk about the expiatory offering. So yes, technically we can learn that according to the stam. We can learn that the expiatory offering isn't needed to eat terumah just from Mishnah. But it's even better. It's also valid to learn that because the same teaching is established in the baraita, that the expiatory offering is dispensable to enable him to eat terumah. Direct citation from the Sifra. So the baraita supports the Gemara's conclusion about the Mishnah. Again, the baraita corroborates what the stam is getting from his interpretation of the Mishnah. I want to make this very clear one more time because this is an incredibly confusing point that really has tripped me personally up. The Mishnah does not say that the priests need the expiatory offering to eat terumah. That is evidence of absence, or absence, is it absence of evidence? I think that's the one. Absence of evidence there in this Mishnah, right? Where here, and I'm highlighting, do you see any discussion of the expiatory offering? Okay, I'm looking, I don't see it. The Mishnah doesn't say that the priests need the expiatory offering to eat terumah. Now, I personally would not go ahead and say, well, this necessarily means that because it's not mentioned here, the priests don't have to do an expiatory offering. But the stam, well, he says, oh, the Mishnah, with its lack of mention of the expiatory offering to eat terumah, he must think, the mishnaic author must think that the priests don't need expiatory offering before eating terumah because the Mishnah never talks about it. And the baraita then is invoked by the stam, the Berakhot being the C-flat portion down here, particularly the expiatory offering is dispensable for the priest to eat terumah. The Berakhot is invoked by the stam to support his own conclusion about the Mishnah, because that Berakhot says exactly what the stam's conclusion about the Mishnah is, right? So the Mishnah never says that the priests have to perform an expiatory offering to eat terumah. The Mishnah never talks about it. Maybe the fact that it never talks about it means that it's still needed. Maybe it's talked about elsewhere, or maybe it means that it's not needed to eat terumah. Either way, personally, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, just because this Mishnah doesn't talk about it, doesn't talk about the expiatory offering, doesn't mean that the priests do or don't have to do it to eat terumah, right? It just isn't stated there. But the stam jumps and says, well, the fact the Mishnah didn't include it must mean that the priest does not have to do an expiatory offering to eat terumah. And so his own conclusion, he brings in the Berakhot to support that. So the stam says that we learn about there being no need for an expiatory offering to eat terumah because the expiatory offering is not mentioned in Mishnah, and the Berakhot that he cites supports that. We're going to now, well, before we move on, let me just also clarify that this Berakhot, again, okay, like I've already said, is really complementing the conclusion of the stam. So I think we've already established that. But what I want to also make note of is that we don't just have one stamitic voice present in this Gemara. We don't just have one person making an argument. We actually have someone pushing back on that very argument. Do you see this but? I once had a teacher who would always say, if you see a but, you need to ask why. If you see a therefore, you need to ask why. If you see something like a however, you need to ask why. So I see a but, and before going any farther, I can say, why is that there? That is odd. We've just gotten the Stam's interpretation of the Mishnah, and then we get this Berakhot citation. Okay, that seems pretty great. I think we're in a good place, right? Like the Stam's understanding is supported, and I feel a lot better rather than doing this evidence of absence of evidence thing that he was doing earlier. I really like his second response where he brings in supporting evidence from the Berakhot. What's so interesting here, this but is here because it introduces an interrogation into the Stam's reasoning. This but how do you know is a classic line that introduces a stamitic interrogation of reasoning. Let's go ahead and read, and I think you're going to see that this is odd. Very odd. But how do you know that these words and the sunsets mean the setting of the sun, and this vetaher means that the day clears away? So let's just focus on this part here. What I first want to note is that we have a second stamitic voice. We have stam 1, who is holding that the priest don't need to do an expiatory offering before eating terumah because of his own reasoning, but also the Berakhot, and the Berakhot is now our new focus. The second stam says, okay, that Berakhot can be interpreted in a few ways. You'll notice that we never actually get stam 1's interpretation of the specific words of the Berakhot, but we can infer them based on how the second stam presents them. How do you know that these words and the sunsets mean the setting of the sun? In other words, stam 2 is attributing a view to stam 1, which is the words and the sunsets means the setting of the sun, and vetaher means that the day clears away. In other words, the day cleans him. So that's the position of the first stam in the words of the second stam. And this stam is going to be stam 2 is going to be interrogating the Berakhot's efficacy at the first stam's justification of his own mishnaic interpretation through the use of the Berakhot. Stam 2, I'll let you know from the next 3 words, thinks that stam 1's use of the Berakhot is not justified. We will see through interrogation of the second stam of the first stam's reasoning whether the Berakhot is a good support for the stam 1's reasoning or whether it needs to be tossed out. But we're already seeing that interrogation in a little bit of shaky ground just based on it means perhaps, i.e., stam 2 has an alternative way at looking at this Berakhot. So it means perhaps, and when the son of the morning appears, and vetaher means the man becomes clean. Let's just pause there. Basically, stam 2 says that the words and the sun sets mean that's the sun of the next morning appearing. And vetaher, rather than the day making this man clean, making the priest clean, it's rather that the man becomes clean. Maybe that's what the true meaning of the Berakhot is. So the stam 2 is going to say that nothing about the eating of terumah and it's linked to the expiatory offering and it's linked to the setting of the sun, going back to the Mishnah, which is going to link, well, going back to the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? The appearance of the stars, i.e., the setting of the sun, being linked to the time the priests entered to eat their terumah, now supposedly being linked to the expiatory offering. We can't really get those links from the Berakhot. That is, the stam 1 has not actually done a great job in selecting this Berakhot because it has some other meanings. So that's where I'm going to leave us, a little bit of a cliffhanger here before we move into some more rabbinic responses and try to clear up the meaning of this Berakhot. But right now we're in a bit of an interesting place because the first stam, it seems so convincing that he cited this Berakhot and it for sure supports his position concerning the expiatory offering not being needed to eat terumah. Right? That seems so good. Until we have stam 2 coming to interrogate that Berakhot's efficacy at justifying the first stam's interpretation of the Mishnah. And so we're going to have a lot of fun kind of working through this passage as we go on and seeing, well, who's right? Stam 1 or stam 2? And again, just to recap where they stand, stam 1 is seeing the words and the sun sets, and this is from Leviticus 22:7. So the words from that verse and the sun sets means the setting of the sun, and vetaher means the day clears away. And stam 2 is saying, well, it's when the sun of the next morning appears, that's what and the sun sets means. And then for vetaher, that's when the man becomes clean. It has nothing to do with the day clearing away. So that's where the two stamitic voices stand right now. They're in conflict with one another. And if stam 2 is correct, it has major implications for this Berakhot's kind of justification for being used to help out the Mishnah or the stam's interpretation, the Mishnah stam 1. So we'll get into this more next time. I'm excited to talk then. But for now, enjoy reviewing all of this Mishnah and all of this Gemara all the way up until this line. I will see you next time.